Some breaking news at this hour. Spokane police say they have solved one of the oldest cold cases in the entire state. SPD now saying they now know who killed a 9-year-old girl all the way back 60 years ago. 9-year-old Candy Rogers disappeared while selling campfire mitts back in 1959. Months later, hunters found her remains. She'd been strangled near Rimrock in northwest Spokane.
She was only 9 years old. When she walked out that Friday, she had 7 boxes of mints in her arms, a dog she'd just patted goodbye, and a mother who'd made her promise to be back before the sun went down. But she never came home. The truth about what happened to Candy Rogers in the spring of 1959 would go unanswered for 63 years. The case would kill 3 men searching for her, drive her father to take his own life, and leave her mother to die at 82, still not knowing who took her daughter. But eventually, through decades of preserved evidence, a laboratory in Texas, and science that didn't exist when Candy was alive, a name finally surfaced. And when it did, the answer was closer to home than anyone had imagined. This is Morbid Instinct, and this is the case of Candy Rogers. If you're watching this for the first time, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we cover the cases that refuse to stay buried. And this one has been waiting over 60 years to be told right. Candy Rogers was born in Spokane, Washington in 1950. As an only child, her parents treated her like she was their entire world right from the beginning, mainly because she was. Her mother, Elaine, was a school teacher, and while her father, Carl, was in the picture early on, the marriage eventually fell apart for reasons they decided to keep private. After the divorce, Candy stayed with her mom, so Elaine made absolutely sure her daughter never felt the absence of anything. If you asked anyone who knew Candy, they all described her the exact same way. She was friendly, she was warm, and she was just the kind of kid who laughed easily and made other people feel comfortable whenever she walked into a room. By the time 1959 rolled around, she was a 9-year-old 4th grader at Holmes Elementary. She was also a proud member of the Bluebirds, the junior branch of the Campfire Girls, which meant her weekends were filled with camping trips, hiking, and community service. And Candy threw herself into all of it with the kind of pure enthusiasm that just made the adults around her stop and smile. Everyone who knew her could see she had a bright future ahead of her, but no one had any idea how fast it was about to be taken away. It was Friday, March 6, 1959. When Candy got home from school, she already had a plan for the afternoon. Her local Bluebirds troupe was doing a fundraiser, meaning she had 7 boxes of campfire mints to sell around the neighborhood. She asked Elaine if she could head out, and her mom said yes, but made sure to remind her, just like she always did, to be home before dark. That wasn't just a casual suggestion, it was a firm rule, and one that Candy had never broken, not once. What happened next was completely ordinary. Candy grabbed an oatmeal cookie and spent a few minutes playing with the family dog before scooping up those 7 boxes of mints and walking out the front door. It was right around 4 p.m. It was just a normal Friday afternoon, so nobody in that house had any reason to suspect it would be the last time they'd ever see her. By 5:30 that evening, Elaine found herself just standing there, listening. It wasn't that she heard something alarming, it was actually the opposite. The house was just too quiet, and Candy was never late. Elaine knew her daughter's routine inside and out, so when that familiar pit-in-your-stomach feeling set in, she didn't ignore it. By 6 p.m., the silence had stretched on long enough, meaning it was time to start making calls. She reached out to Candy's grandfather, Stanley Newton, and within the hour, a makeshift search party of family, neighbors, and friends was out walking the streets. At first, things seemed completely normal. The people they talked to confirmed they'd seen Candy earlier that afternoon, walking her usual route with boxes tucked under her arms, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. But somewhere between one house and the next, the sightings just stopped. Nobody could say where she went after that. It was getting dark by 7 p.m., which only added to the urgency. Stanley and a group of volunteers were still out combing the area when a car came out of nowhere and nearly ran them down. They had to throw themselves out of the way, but even though they were shaken up, they didn't stop looking. No one was willing to just go home and leave a little girl out there in the dark. By 9 p.m., police officers and sheriff's deputies had officially joined the search, and that's when they finally found something along Petite Drive. There were 6 boxes of campfire mints just scattered across the road. But Candy had left home with 7. One was missing. Nobody could explain how those 6 boxes ended up in the dirt or what it meant, let alone what had happened in the gap between her last sighting and this discovery. What they didn't know then was that this missing box, that one single detail, would become the very first piece of evidence in a case that would take 60 more years to close. The search ultimately had to be called off for the night without finding her, so Elaine went back to an empty house. She didn't sleep. Instead, she just sat by the window, listening to every passing car and every random noise out on the street. Every set of footsteps made her hold her breath, but none of them were Candy's. By the next morning, the whole city of Spokane already knew what was happening, and the community's response was massive. Volunteers poured out in numbers that completely filled the streets, while officers scoured the area on horseback and in patrol cars. They combed through roads, parks, and thick stretches of woodland, going over the same ground again and again. The search area was expanding, so to help cover the rugged terrain that was just too vast for people on foot, the Air Force sent up a helicopter. But that helicopter never came back. While flying low over the Spokane River to scan the ground, the pilot suddenly came up on a high-tension power line, meaning there was absolutely no time to react. The aircraft struck the wire, lost control, and plummeted directly into the water below. The crash killed all 3 men on board on impact: Airman Merlise D. Ray, Sergeant William A. McDonnell, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fatek. These were 3 men who had just set out that morning to help find a missing 9-year-old girl, and now, tragically, they weren't coming home either. It was a devastating blow to the community, but the search simply had to continue. Stopping now would have felt like those men died for nothing, and absolutely no one in Spokane was willing to accept that. 16 days after Candy first walked out of her front door, 2 airmen named Howard Lawrence and Richard Bergen happened to be out in a wooded area about 7 miles from her home. They weren't actually out there searching for Candy, they were just hunting woodchucks. But as they moved through a small clearing deep in the trees, they stumbled across a pair of blue suede shoes. They were small, clearly a child's size, and they were just sitting there in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the neighborhood where Candy had started her route. Realizing what this could mean, the men brought the shoes straight to the police. When Candy's grandfather was called in to look at them, it didn't take long at all. He knew immediately that they were hers. By the next morning, well before dawn, officers and volunteers had already descended on that clearing. They spread out and combed through the trees, but for a while they found absolutely nothing. And then one of the officers noticed a small mound of brush and pine needles that just didn't look natural. He walked over, crouched down to carefully brush the leaves aside, and that's when he found Candy. She had been deliberately hidden beneath the pile, and the details of the scene were devastating. Her clothes were torn, and even worse, her feet had been bound with a piece of fabric, meaning she had been tied up, with another strip wrapped around her neck. When authorities broke the news to Elaine Rogers, the sheer horror of it was so overwhelming that she collapsed and ultimately had to be sedated. And that same afternoon, the 1,000+ people who had spent the last 2 weeks desperately searching for this little girl had to face the crushing reality that she had been out there in those woods the whole time. This is the part of the story where most cold cases go silent permanently. Evidence degrades, witnesses die, detectives retire, files collect dust, and the victim fades from the public memory until they exist only in a name on a folder nobody opens anymore. That almost happened to Candy. Almost. If this case is getting under your skin the way I think it is, take a quick second to pause the video and drop a comment down below. Let me know what you're thinking so far, or if you already had a suspect in mind before we even got to this point. The conversations we have in the comments on cases like this are always worth reading. And while you're down there, if you haven't liked this video yet, now is a great time to do it. It genuinely helps the algorithm push Candy's story to more people. And after 60 years, she deserves to be heard. By the year 2001, DNA technology had finally advanced far enough to give investigators something they hadn't had in decades: a real shot at answers. Thankfully, Candy's clothing from 1959 had been incredibly well preserved in the evidence room for over 40 years, so detectives sent it off to the lab. Forensic investigators carefully worked through the samples and managed to isolate a DNA profile from Candy's underwear, which they immediately uploaded into the national database. But there was no match. A year later, in 2002, they decided to run that same profile directly against their longtime prime suspect, Hugh Byron Morse. But after decades of him sitting at the very top of their list, the results came back and completely eliminated him. It wasn't Morse. Meaning, just like that, the case went cold all over again. Even worse, in September of 2006, tragedy quietly struck the family one last time. Elaine Rogers passed away at home at the age of 82. She had spent the last 47 years of her life desperately waiting for someone to tell her who took her little girl, but time just ran out. She died never knowing the truth. As the decades passed, the case never actually closed. But it didn't exactly die, either. In fact, Spokane detective Zach Stormont would later describe it as the Mount Everest of their cold cases, meaning it was the one obstacle they could never seem to overcome, and also the one that nobody ever forgot. By 2017, a new method was quietly transforming cold case investigations, and it was finally gaining serious traction: forensic genetic genealogy. It's basically a mix of advanced DNA analysis and traditional family tree research, meaning investigators no longer needed an exact database match to find a suspect. Instead, they could use a DNA profile to identify the killer's relatives, distant cousins, half-siblings, really anyone who shared enough genetic material, and then work outward through family trees until they found the source. So, detectives brought in Brittany Wright, a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, to take a fresh look at Candy's case. She went straight to the freezer and pulled out the DNA sample that had been sitting in cold storage since 2001. First, she reanalyzed it just to be sure it still matched the original perpetrator's profile, and once she confirmed that it did, she sent it off to a private lab for genealogical processing. But the lab came back with the one answer she didn't want to hear. The sample was too degraded to work with. It really looked like that was it. After everything they'd been through, the carefully preserved clothing, the decades in storage, the rebuilt profile, the DNA itself just wasn't usable anymore. Investigators had pushed this case further than anyone ever had, only to hit a wall they couldn't get past. But then, they heard about a laboratory down in Texas called Othram, which was a facility built specifically to handle heavily degraded DNA, the exact kind of samples that conventional labs turned away. So, Brittany reached out to them, and once she confirmed that Candy's case qualified, she carefully packaged up what little remained of the sample and shipped it off. 6 months later, Othram came back with results. they had successfully narrowed the profile down and flagged 3 brothers as possible suspects: John, Andrew, and Terry Hoff. But there was a catch. All 3 of them were already dead. So investigators pulled everything they could find on the Hoff brothers, starting with the oldest, John. He had grown up in Spokane, and back in 1959, right around the time of Candy's murder, he was 20 years old. More importantly, he was living just about a mile away from her home. And when they looked into his background, his history basically told its own story. He had enlisted in the Army in 1956, but in 1961, just 2 years after Candy died, he was arrested for attacking a woman. The details were chillingly familiar. He had approached the victim in bottom daylight, forcibly removed her clothing while she screamed, and then actually used those clothes to bind her hands before attempting to strangle her. Fortunately, the woman survived, but John only served 6 months for the attack. And on top of that, the Army discharged him as a deserter. After he got out, he seemed to just fade into a quiet life, doing some sales work and taking a job at a local lumberyard. But that quiet life didn't last long, because at 31 years old, he took his own life. As detectives kept digging, they found one more crucial thread. It turned out John's stepsister had been a 10-year-old campfire girl at the time of the murder, and she had actually taken on the role of Candy's big sister within the program. For investigators, this was the bridge. This was exactly how John knew her. To finally prove it, they tracked down John's daughter, Kathy. But when detectives reached out to her, they were surprised to find out she had already been looking into the case herself after hearing police were asking questions around town. She already knew exactly who Candy was, meaning she was fully prepared for what they were going to ask. She willingly handed over a DNA sample. When the lab analysis came back, the numbers were staggering. The results stated it was 2.9 million times more likely that Kathy's DNA was related to the suspect's profile than any random person off the street. John Hoff was Candy's killer. Armed with Kathy's consent and a court order, investigators went to the cemetery where John was buried. They exhumed his remains, extracted a direct DNA sample, and sent it straight to the lab for confirmation. The results came back, and it was a perfect match. Former detective Brian Hammond, who had worked Candy's case right up until his retirement in 2021, admitted that they had gotten incredibly lucky. After all, DNA profiling wasn't even a concept back in 1959. So the fact that Candy's clothing survived over 4 decades in an evidence room and actually retained enough viable material for Othram to work with was truly the only reason they caught her killer. Hammond himself said that without that preserved clothing, he didn't believe the mystery would have ever been solved. Not ever. When the police finally brought the news to Candy's surviving relatives, it was a complicated moment. Her 77-year-old cousin, Joanne Poss, said it wasn't exactly closure, but it was something. At the very least, the killer's name was finally attached to the crime. But the hardest part for Joanne to sit with was the reality of time. Candy's parents and grandparents had all gone to their graves without ever knowing what happened. They carried that immense weight for their entire lives, only to put it down without any real resolution. As for John's daughter, Kathy, the revelation broke something open that could never be closed again. Her father had died when she was just 9 years old, meaning she had spent her whole life believing a very specific narrative, the tragic story of a quiet, depressed man who simply couldn't go on. But now she understood that wasn't the truth at all. She didn't call him damaged, and she didn't call him broken. She called him evil. It deeply disgusted her that he got to die with people thinking he was an upstanding man, when in reality he was anything but. Ultimately, Kathy did the only thing she felt she could do. She issued a public, heartbreaking apology to Candy's family. She told them how genuinely sorry she was for what her father had done, and for the life he had stolen from them. And while there would never be any real courtroom justice, since the man responsible was already decades in the ground, she hoped that after all this time, Candy's family could finally find some measure of peace in simply knowing the truth. Through the actions of one man on one Friday afternoon in 1959, a little girl's life was cut short, and a family was left in darkness for over 60 years. But the case of Candy Rogers is also something else. It is proof that evidence carefully preserved outlasts the people who preserved it, that science, given enough time and the right hands, can reach back through decades and find what was hidden in the dark. At the end of the day, Candy Rogers was
And
just
police say
a
they would like to
9-year-old
talk to
girl.
anyone who
She
knew
walked
Huff.
out the door with 7 boxes of mints, patted her dog goodbye, and made a strict promise to be home before dark. By all accounts, she kept every promise she ever made. It was the world that failed to keep its promise to protect her. But now, 63 years later, her case is finally closed. Her killer has a name. And most importantly, her story isn't going to fade away. Not here on this channel, and definitely not by anyone who stayed to the end to hear the truth. If Candy's story, the little girl from Spokane, Washington, moved you today, and I genuinely hope it did, do me a favor and just leave her name down in the comments. Just her name, and nothing else. That way we can fill up that entire section so even the algorithm has to recognize that a little girl from Spokane still matters all these years later. And while you're down there, I'd love to hear your take on this case. Do you think John's murder of Candy was pre-planned, or was it a random act? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, because having this conversation helps keep her memory alive. If you can, please hit like, share, and subscribe. It helps more people find Candy's story. And I'll see you in the next one.